Hey there. Welcome to Data Humans, the podcast where I ask everyday data people what a career in data looks like for them. I'm your host, Libby. I hope you'll come with me on my journey as I learn how to podcast and as I learn what data looks like for as many different people as I can meet. Let's dive in. Hello, Richard. Thank you so much for joining me today.
You're welcome, and thank you for the invitation.
This is Richard DeWald, a registered nurse, senior system admin, and hospice data analyst. Hospice care is a special kind of healthcare focused on quality of life and comfort for patients who are experiencing advanced illness. He's a man who has always lived between two worlds, it seems, blending patient care and a natural affinity for computers and data. This episode is a little bit different. It was truly a privilege to hear Richard's story, and I hope you enjoy hearing it as much as I did. Today you'll hear us talk about his journey to data through the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. If you didn't yet know someone who has personally emailed the man who invented the World Wide Web before the World Wide Web was a thing, now you do. Happy New Year, Data Humans. I took a wonderful break for the holidays in December, and I'm excited to ring in January 2023 with this episode. I'm so excited to talk to you. I have been anticipating talking to you specifically on the podcast for months now because we met many months ago, and you are truly an interesting human being. So I can't wait to hear more about your story and share it with other people. So, could you tell me, in a nutshell, how you got here? And I know that this is a long story because I've heard it and it's amazing.
And it changes a little bit every time I tell it because that's the way that recollection is. That's something you'll realize as you get to be my age. So where did it start? I mean, it really goes back to my interest in citizens band radio way back when I was like 11, 12, 13. I was a little nerdy kid, little techie kid. I was an only child. So my parents got tired of me of taking apart all the appliances in the house because I would do that just to figure out how they worked, and found a habit, which was building these little citizens band radios, which I felt like was harmless enough. And it was, but at that time, this was pre-internet. This was in the 70s. The only way you could get parts was to go to swap meets. So I learned very quickly that you showed up at a particular parking lot on Saturday, and you brought the parts that you had and didn't need, and you tried to trade them with cash for the parts that they had that you needed. And uh, when computers came along just in the late 70s, it was the very same crowd that was putting together home computers. That's the reason that I'm telling this story. So I got into building my own home computers very early. That was really like the first, you know, thing I learned to do that I could actually continue to do as an adult and, as a profession. Then I grew up and I was in Dallas and I went to college at the University of Texas in Austin, and I was a stutterer. I'm still a stutterer. I'm just was a much more severe stutterer then. So when it came to choosing my foreign language, because one was required for my degree plan, I chose Latin because I knew I couldn't have an oral test in Latin because they didn't know how it was pronounced.
Yep.
It's 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 remarkable to me now, actually, that it didn't occur to me to just go to them and say, "Look, I have this problem.
Right.
you know, I'd like to learn Spanish, but I'm not going to be able to take an oral exam." And I'm sure if there weren't already accommodations made for people like me, I would have gotten some help. But it never occurred to me to do that. Instead, I made the preemptive choice and said, "Well, I'll just learn Latin that way. Uh, uh, don't ever get an oral exam." So the first couple of years at the classics department at UT, a lot of your training in Latin was drilling by computers. So a lot of your first and second year classes, you sat in front of computers and you were drilled on nouns and verbs and that kind of thing. And these drills broke down. And because I had been a hobbyist already in high school, when they broke down, I could see clearly what was going wrong. So I would then turn to the teaching assistant in the lab and say, "Hey, you've got a problem over here. It's probably this, that, and the other." And they quickly hired me, and this pattern continued the rest of my career. Hired me as help, so I became a what they call the work study program, where I worked a certain number of hours a week to offset my tuition, and my parents were very happy with that because that made college cheaper.
And this was the early 80s, right? In the language lab.
Th- th- This was actually 78 and 79
Okay,
in the
late 70s.
language lab. We were actually on a dumb terminal that was connected to a VAX that was across the street. It was, computers were still a building
Right.
then. So, anyway, fast forward, that turned into me working as a tech person in the local community in Austin that put on shows, put on concerts, ran theaters, that kind of stuff, did the lighting and the sound and that kind of stuff. I was useful to those people, so it was easy for me to work in communities. So I worked in those communities until 1982, and that was when AIDS hit. And it was particularly devastating um, in those communities that I worked in.
Right. In the entertainment communities.
Right. So all I could do at that time was try to help my friends. So I just started going to their homes when they were sick and doing what they needed done. And as the various AIDS activist groups kind of sprouted up around all that, they figured out what I was doing was being a home health aide. So they organized ways for me to get hired, and I worked privately for a while, and then I worked as a home health aide, uh, just with just with an agency, and I was about 25 or 26, and I decided, well, the best thing I can do is become a full nurse, a registered nurse. Plus, I
Right.
was dating a nurse at the time too,
That was
and
such a great part of your story. You said, I fell in love with a nurse and I watched what she
yeah,
was able to do.
right. And her and I are still friends to this day. And well, because there was a nursing shortage in the mid '80s too,
Hmm.
and my girlfriend could literally just call the hospital and tell them what shift she wanted to work. That was the way the power went. They
Right.
didn't tell her when to come to work. They wouldn't dare. They tried to make conditions acceptable enough that she would want to work a lot. So that really appealed to my kind of independent, anti-authoritarian spirit.
Right.
And so that was another thing that was attractive about nursing. So I went to nursing school. I I was studying psychology and history, and I have this odd combination of a bachelor of arts in psychology and a bachelor of science in nursing, but that's another story. And by the time I got out of nursing school, we had the antiretrovirals. It was early, and every population with AIDS, because I was committed to working with the AIDS populations, uh, could use them except neonates,
Hmm.
except newborn babies. They weren't approved for newborn babies back then. So I thought, okay, I've got all this experience, with with in the professional environment with working with HIV. I know what labs matter.
Right.
I know what drugs matter, that kind of stuff. I know how to handle blood and bodily fluids that are HIV infected. So I thought, okay, I'll go into neonatal intensive care, and that's where I'll become most useful. Well, I actually loved neonatal intensive care. and I still love taking care of infants. It's just I have an affinity for it. And so I worked in that for a while, but I was also diabetic, and I was working pretty much exclusively at night, and that is very hard to manage diabetes when you're off rhythm with the rest of the world.
Right.
And so I knew if I did home care, that would be happening during the day. So again, just like the choice I made about what what language to take in college, I I just made it instead of going to my employer and saying, "Look, I have a disability. I need to work during the day," and gotten on the day shift because the day shift was really hard to get on. In fact, the joke around the unit was somebody had to die for you to get a shift on
Oh, goodness.
that was the only way they opened up because once you got a day shift, you kept it. And because that was also when the unit was the most fun. That was when the families were there and everything. So anyway, I started doing home care, and that appealed to my free, independent, anti-authoritarian spirit too, because this was back when home care was fee for service, and you basically just got paid for doing visits. You do as many or as few as you wanted to, and they would take you for as much work as you wanted to do. So in each of those cases, both in the neonatal intensive care group, at the end of my time there, they drug me into some database work that they wanted to start collecting from their new electronic health records. These were new. Putting vital signs into computers was something that happened during the early part of my nursing career, and they were like, "Oh crap, we've got this data. We've got to learn how to organize it." So they knew I was the computer guy. I was the guy that was always answering everybody's computer questions, and I knew how to use the systems because it's always been intuitive for me. I always know what a database wants from me, and so they drugged me into a couple of processes there, and then when I got into home care, they said, "Hey, you want to come into the office and help us manage these electronic systems? You can work your own hours, and we'll pay you well enough. And if you want to do some home visits, you can do, and you can do what you want to do." That also appealed to me. Having
Yeah.
choices, not having people telling me what to do is really that's always the downhill path in my life. So I started doing the home care EHR work for them. That was a little complicated because they had, I mean, we literally, the first one I used was on a Palm Pilot. And you have to be a certain age to even know what a Palm
Yep.
Pilot
I
is.
remember Palm Pilots.
But we actually used them as early bedside ways to gather information. And so I always like had one foot in the IT part, but I really like taking care of patients. That's a big part of who I am
Right.
is uh, you know communing with humans is important to me. So I always said okay, but I mean in every case I have said until this last job I've said okay, I'll take the job, but I have to still be able to work some
With
at
people.
the bedside.
Right.
I'll help you with your computer issues, but I've got to stay in touch as a nurse. That also was smart, unintentionally smart, because I also it forced me to always be translating between those two worlds.
And stay up
I
to date
all
too.
I was always somehow making nurses make sense to IT, or I was making IT make sense to the nurses. And uh, as I then settled on becoming a data analyst, because literally I what we needed to do in the agency was such low hanging fruit. I couldn't stand anymore that nobody was doing it. All it needed was a moderately complex Microsoft Access database.
Hmm.
And we could have and could and did wipe out essentially four jobs that we didn't need and put those resources back to take away from the office and taking care of patients. That was the deal. So I did that, and that got everyone's attention. And they because the internal changes in my agency there that are interesting to me, but no one else. I ended up being pulled out of the hospice, which is where I worked, into the business intelligence and analytics department, and because they decided that they needed a subject matter expert in nursing, but the truth was I was the only one who, literally the only one in the company that knew how to wrangle the data out of the hospice medical record into an Oracle database. There were transformations that need to be done, and I had just with SAS had gone through and just done all those transformations, and and then I could work with the data in SAS, and that made me useful to the data science department because I could give them analyzable, tidy data sets to use,
Right.
which was what they couldn't retrieve from the hospice medical record at that time.
And I think you said that they actually sent you to learn SAS, right?
Yes, they did. They sent me to the Manhattan SAS Academy, which is on the 47th floor of a beautiful building on 7th Avenue that literally overlooks Central Park. I mean, it's yeah, it's like, it's a place to film a Netflix, like a Netflix series on some kind of Manhattan business intrigue. But yeah, SAS, I have to say, does an excellent job with adult education. They really know how to do it. And plus, I was a person who I can't explain it, but I seem to understand data
Intuitively.
easier.
Yes.
Yeah, well, yeah, it is intuitively. If you think of fast and slow thinking,
Mm-hmm.
my mind won. The fast is really good with data. I see patterns really quickly, and I can infer meaning from patterns in data from a table. So it's like, other people just, think that's just the most wonderful thing, but literally it's like looking out the window to me. It's just apparent. So yeah, that has always made me useful. Again, in between the data scientists who need every row to be an observation or every column to be an observation and every row to be an instance. When you know, and I can get that from the database because I understand why the database is the way it is because I've not only used it, but I understand what it is they're trying to get out from the clinicians and what the limitations of that are. So I can reverse engineer what everybody intends because I have been out there with my laptop at the bedside with a dying person entering that data in so the other people working on the case know what to do. And so I've always been like in between worlds, and now I feel where I've ended up, I'm with a bunch of people that are far more brilliant than I am. All of them are have a PhD, or almost all of them do, and the ones who don't have a PhD's level of experience.
And these are in like
And
mathematics and computer science and stuff. This is not
well, now,
medical.
yeah, well, now they give PhDs, in data science. So
Right.
yeah, yeah, it's all of those things. The older people have math degrees. Oh boy, I hope they don't listen to this.
Don't worry, I
And the
don't
young
have many listeners.
and the younger people don't. Yeah, well, and the younger people, have the data science, analytics degrees,
Hmm.
and they're all very curious people. They're not working for a nonprofit because this was where they could make the most money. They're working for a nonprofit health organization because they're interested in uh, uh, health data. Some are interested in clinical data, some are interested in financial data, some are interested in, kind of the health economics side of it. But they all have a passion in it, so it makes it really easy to work with them because you don't really have to motivate them. They're already self motivated. I am too because I really go to work every day. God, it sounds so corny to say this, but it's the truth. I decide what I'm going to do every day as if my mother was on the hospice program.
That's a good North Star.
You know, what can I do today that would be most useful to her?
Right. And
So,
your story was full of self-driven moments, by the way. I know that you said a lot of your choices were driven by avoiding one thing or another, like avoiding Spanish, but so many of your choices were really driven um, by your North Star and your mission to do what was right.
yeah, right. Because I don't know. There's a lot of reasons for this. Some of them are pretty dark, but I somehow realized early on that life doesn't give you any inherent meaning.
You
There's
got to
no
go
so
find it.
that you it's your job to give it meaning.
Mm-hmm.
That's what you do. And okay, well, I want my life to mean things are better. I mean,
I think
it's
you've
just that
done that.
simple.
And you also have been the go-to data person. Your whole story has this theme of being the person who is really focused on caring, patient care, and who also has the data ability. And you kind of put yourself out there to do the job, which gets you more opportunities to do the job that's in data because people rely on that. And I think that another interesting thing about self-learning for you is that you went and learned SAS, but then you got in with all these PhDs. And I remember you told me that they all used R, and you thought, okay, well, I've got to use R now. So you said you picked up a book from Hadley, which is probably, let me
Or
see,
for data science.
R for Data Science by Hadley
Yeah,
Wickham, which I
yeah,
will link in the show notes for everybody.
yeah,
It's famous. Hadley has lots of books, right? So it could be one
yeah,
of
yeah,
one of like three or four.
yeah. No, but I literally, that was the book I picked up when I knew nothing about, I didn't even know how to open an R session.
And you said you picked a problem
Yes.
and said, I am just going to figure out how to solve this problem with R, which I think is fantastic advice today for anybody who wants to learn a programming language and pitch it as a use case for their business, finding a problem and solving it within that language, and then showing people what you've done. Do you remember what you decided to work on?
Yeah, it was an analysis of the reasons people discharged from the hospice other than death.
Okay.
And it was like one of those rare requests that came in like weeks before they needed it. I had like 6 weeks to do this, and they're like, "Yeah, just by the next quality meeting, we want to get these broken down this way." And so it meant cre- creating new categories and putting things in new categories, and then doing summaries, statistics, and kind of A/B testing on those categories. Fairly straight ahead descriptive analysis, and I had 6 weeks to do it. And I knew it was low hanging fruit in R,
Mm-hmm.
because I'd been seeing the things that people. Now, in SAS, I could have completed that analysis in probably 3 or 4 hours of work.
Right.
Just one afternoon with with a coffee and bang. So, but I had 6 weeks to do it, so I thought, oh, okay, I'll just do this in R.
And learn R
So
along the
I will
way.
give myself my base data set right.
Mm-hmm.
I already intuitively knew what a tidy data set was, and that just came from using Access. You have to also use tidy. If you're going to use Access to actually do things, your data has to be tidy. It's not that powerful an engine. So I just got my got the data. save that to a CSV on my laptop,
Mm-hmm.
and close SAS,
And you said,
and
I'm going to do this in R.
and open the book. Yeah, it's like, okay, I'm going to do this in R. So I literally had to figure it out from there, and it took about 4 weeks. And it was the learning curve. Everybody says this because it's true. Is very steep at the beginning. You
It
have to
is.
learn a lot before you can like do anything that is at all gratifying.
Right. I will
But
echo that.
then, yeah,
Same.
but then when you like reach the point that you're okay, some light went on in your head, then the reward for the effort you invest beyond that point is richly rewarded.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just making that investment to get up to the point where I don't know what I would call it, but I guess where I started feeling safe using packages where I understood how to configure the inputs for the functions, but I didn't understand the functions for doing it all. I mean, that was way beyond my. So it was like once I felt like I understood things well enough to know how to not go off the rails, to use something like like time series modeling software without even approaching knowing how the mathematics works.
Right. The statistics behind it.
Then basically it became okay, hunt down the right package you need and go. And,
Yeah.
and then Hadley in our studio and everybody had sort of made their stuff downhill. I mean, what Hadley did, his I think primary insight was that you need a syntax that works across functions, so that so you can learn the syntax and apply functions to it rather than having to learn a new syntax for everything you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
And that so I became a pretty much tidyverse devotee and evangelist at first. I mean, I was one of those annoying people, and then I settled down as I saw things like what you can do with data table and things like that. So, but I am very happy now that, for example, I'm in San Francisco right now. I've been here 3 weeks. I don't live here. I live outside of Lowell, Massachusetts. But I had some friends who were going to be out of town for an extended time, and invited me to come house sit. So the nice thing about the job now is I just picked up and came out here. I literally just had a travel day, and I was right by at work. And because my best friends in San Francisco are the ones who are not here, I'm in kind of a burrow here. So I've gotten a lot of work done, and then
Maintaining your freedom, I see.
maintaining my freedom, and then I go back and go home and continue to work, and I always felt like that was the better way to take a vacation. It's like not take a bunch of time off and go somewhere and then just basically be a bum, go around and just do stuff. No, I wanted a transporter so I could just go ahead and work during the day, and then after I got off work at night, I could go somewhere cool
Yeah.
and have like a cool experience in the evening, come home and go back to work the next day. Well, that's what this job enables me to do, and yeah, it still feeds the anti-authoritarian
This reminds me of a story you told me, which kind of blew my mind. You said that back in maybe the early 2000s, like 2005 or 2006, that when you were first getting into this Access database stuff and you were kind of pushing the power of early dashboards, that you woke up every morning at 7 o'clock in the morning and ran macros for a BI dashboard that you had put together, which was the first one, just so that you could sell the value of having a dashboard where you could wake up in the morning and look at it and see what happened yesterday, which now we take that for granted, and it's something that we can spin up very quickly. I could put out a dashboard pretty quickly and have it connected to streaming data, but that's not something that was all over the place. It wasn't ubiquitous in 2005 or 2006.
No,
And you said you did that from all over the world. You're like, I got up and ran those macros from Tuscany or wherever I was.
I did. Actually, I think that was the distance. That was the distance record. Yeah,
Was
I was
Tuscany?
on a hill. Yeah, I was on a hilltop in Tuscany. Yeah, at a pizza place. Yeah, Penzano, I think. And yeah, I did that 365 days a year for 4.5 years.
Wow.
And no matter where I was or how I felt or how hard it was to get an internet connection, I did it from the closet in Las Vegas, I remember, so I wouldn't wake anybody else up in the room. And yeah, no, and all I had to do was basically run this macro. There just wasn't a way to automate it that the IT department at the time would allow me to do. I mean, I could have, done some scripting or made it like a Windows thing, but they wouldn't give me permission to do that. Oh no, oh no,
This
we're
was
not
early
going to let
days
it.
in your kind
Yeah,
of,
there's well, I was a nurse to them.
right.
It's like, no, we're not going to give that permission to a nurse. You're foolish for even asking. So basically, I stopped asking. So I said, okay. So yeah, I know. So I had to get up, log onto the VPN. Once I was on the VPN, I had to log into another terminal server, and then use that terminal server to run the macro. And then it generated a bunch of HTML files and PNG images that I wrote a web framework for, like a web page for, and that's how the dashboard was displayed. Was every time I ran the Access database, all of the previous data was just overwritten. So, and so, it was updated every day. And because the links in the actual website were all static HTML, there was no scripting going on at all. It was super fast. And everybody loved that. You could just click, 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 and get exactly what you needed. And of course, we've completely lost that in the dashboard world now.
Right.
None of the major systems work that way. But it made the dashboard popular, and it was intuitive. People didn't have to be trained to use it. And they figured out that, yeah, these numbers that I was telling them all added up at the end of the month to the same ones that they ran, with their Excel spreadsheets and all that. And so it got a reputation for being reliable. Then when I learned SAS, I could draw plots. And so I started drawing plots and making a really kind of nice dashboard for them, but it was all still static HTML images, PNG images that were linked to others. If you were looking at the admission plot, what happened for the week, and you were interested in who was admitted, all you had to do was click the plot and boom, there's the list of the admissions for the week. So people really liked that, because it wasn't all queries that you had to call and wait for. No, the data was all done, everything was run. It was just a stack of HTML pages, which, I all I all I've been online since before the World Wide Web existed.
Right.
So I remember when they were called hypertext stacks, not websites. And so it was kind of satisfying to bring th- that uh, that technology all the way forward, like 2 decades, and it's still the favorite way I have for setting up dashboards.
Well,
Although I don't do it anymore.
one of my favorite things that you said the first time I met you was that at one point you had um, someone for a master list. of
Hmm.
stacks or something. And it ended
Tim
up being Tim
Berners-Lee.
Berners-Lee, which is the man who invented the World Wide Web. For anybody
Yep.
who does not remember or doesn't know, you told me the story and you kind of left that to the end. You were like, yeah, I just had to I just had to email this person for a master list of links. And oh, it just happened to be Tim Berners-Lee. You witnessed the birth of the internet truly, because you said you had gotten a shell account from the university, which is
Yep.
kind of the
Because I
only
was working in the
place.
classics department. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
One of the only
Right.
places was like a university or an employer where you could get a shell account,
On a
which
Vax. Yeah.
which gave you a user account on a remote Linux server,
Yeah.
right? So you were able
Yep.
to have email, you were able to do distribution lists before the internet existed, when this was like a physical location speaking to other physical locations, and they hadn't been
Yes.
connected yet. The World
Oh
Wide
yeah.
Web
No.
hadn't been put together yet when you were doing this.
No. It was a trusted network. It was literally only universities and the military.
In the military, yeah.
Yeah, every node was owned by either a university or a government worldwide. So when you ran a server back then, your default rule was open all the ports. We'll take anything you're sending us. Let's make sure that we're understanding all this stuff you're sending us, and you can have whatever you want. Our ports are all open. If you want to query our database, go right ahead. So that's the problem we still have with the internet today. Was when we actually put it together originally, it was a trusted network, and it's still a problem with email. When you wanted to email somebody back then, you sat at your command line interface, and you used a program called email, and it was email, Tim Berners Lee at wherever he was, subject this, and then you just kept typing, and then when you hit enter, the email went, and yeah, it was a three. I think I have it somewhere, and one of my aspirations in 2023 is to find it. But I remember it was a 300K text file that was a list of every site that was reachable by hypertext protocol.
And you said that the University of Kansas had the repo for the hypertext stacks, and so they gave people tape space. And for people who don't know what tape space means, that's very old school for, memory
Coin.
space. And right.
It's money. Yeah, no, it was money. Because that was not cheap to maintain. Yeah, the University of Kansas does not get the credit that it deserves for uh, putting the internet kind of over a hump in the
Hmm.
very early days. Because if you needed it, they had it, and you could download it,
I learned so much from talking to
whatever it
you.
was.
I mean,
Yeah.
I got really curious after I talked with you, because you said a lot of things that I didn't understand, and I had to go Google them and make sure I understood what you meant. And one
Oh,
thing I remember you saying was, when you learned HTML, you're like, yeah, I went and got an O'Reilly book and I learned HTML from it. And I thought, wow, how long has O'Reilly been around? Turns out O'Reilly started in the late 70s doing consulting. They started
yep,
putting out Unix manuals by like the mid 80s, and then they kind of went from there. Data people have been learning from O'Reilly for decades.
yeah.
And still, a lot of us today have learned a lot of what we've learned from an O'Reilly Media book.
Hmm.
And they've been doing that for a
Hmm.
really long time. And now,
Hmm.
all these years later, you're an R admin. We haven't really got to that yet, but you learned R. You're
Yep,
working with all of these very brilliant people who are working in R, and you realize
in
that,
Python.
and Python, and you realize that people were
Yeah.
having a hard time sharing things back and forth and needed a solution. And the solution in your mind was like, well, this is obviously a problem that a server can solve if we have R on a server. And then you kind of went from there figuring stuff out. So again, you were the right person in the right place at the right time with the right knowledge to kind of become who you are. So you're now a senior system admin, is that right?
Yeah, no, I run the on-premises servers that we use. We have a couple of very beefy servers in the Manhattan office, even though we're not supposed to. We're supposed to be 100% cloud, because replicating these servers in the cloud would be like $100,000 a month. So they allow us to say, "Oh, okay, if it's that much, you can keep your servers." So, yeah, the most efficient way to run any computer hardware is to use Linux. It makes the fullest exploitation of the capabilities of the hardware that is possible. So it really came down to, oh, there's this guy that knows R and understands data, and he's also been running Linux boxes since the mid 90s, which was true. Part of the story I left out was in the early 90s, I ran a bulletin board service thing that people could get on their modem and call my house and get onto my server and use various resources there. They could download my files. There were chat rooms. We had an internet gateway so they could send email and receive email. And I worked on a system called Opus, if anybody wants to look it up. I was on FidoNet. I was node 1382/70, if you really want to look it up. And I just, liked helping people connect to technology as a hobby. Plus, it was a problem to solve. I always like to have problems to solve. That turned in the late 90s to maintaining a web server. And I maintained a web server in my house, an actual public facing web server for about 6 years and learned an awful lot about that as it was hacked and taken down multiple times.
Oh
And
my gosh, that's trial by
uh,
fire.
oh yeah, yeah. I was very interesting to a Bulgaria for some reason, and because there really wasn't anything there, and it was just my email. But uh, I remember, and so when it came. So fast forward to 2015, 2016, they needed to uh, get everybody on the same server using our studio, what's now our studio workbench. It was our studio server pro
Pro,
back
yeah.
then.
Hmm.
Yeah. And they needed somebody to manage that because the IT department were all Windows. And if you can't right click it, they don't know how to fix it. And so I was the guy. They asked me if I'd be willing to do that. And once again, it's like every time I try to get out of IT, they keep pulling me back in. But it also made what I was trying to do with the hospice, kind of the data evangelizing I was doing with the hospice, much easier for me to have my own web server to work with. It's like, okay, bing, all those problems are immediately solved. So, yeah, sure, I'll run this server for you. And yeah, that's turned into probably half of my job now because we have Workbench Connect, our studio package manager, and we're using Visual Studio Code, and we're using Docker, Kubernetes for orchestration management. That and all that now is what we're getting into now. So I'm the grumpy sysadmin because I'm very Old Testament when it comes to running the actual box. I have rules. You follow them or find somebody else to run this box. And uh, but it keeps the box up. It runs well. So even though there are people a lot smarter than me that are working on the containers, that are helping me turn the screws with Kubernetes and AWS instances and that kind of stuff, I'm still kind of the keep the servers at the office working guy. And it's just system administration, and it's a challenge. We are partially a health insurance company, and so we have large data sets.
Yeah, lots of work to do, lots of abilities to continue to kind of follow your North Star, which has been making sure people are at the forefront of everything you do. Do you miss working with people? I know that this is sort of like you said that you had consciously stayed in the
Ooh,
people space, connecting with
good
human
question.
beings for a while, and until this job, you had kind of really demanded that you stay there, and you
Uh-huh.
let that go a little bit to do the system admin stuff.
and then COVID hit.
And then COVID hit. Yeah.
Yeah, and I got my opportunity to go back to the bedside. So I'm a diabetic with immune system issues, so I couldn't actually go out, and it was heartbreaking, particularly in the early part of the COVID epidemic, because what they needed was people who were good in intensive care using ventilators, and I was very good in intensive care using ventilators. I could use an endotracheal tube. I could solve any ventilator problem almost intuitively, and that's exactly who they needed. But I would have not, I would have not survived,
Right.
and I knew that. So I kept doing my job, and then a year later, in January 2021, the vaccines became available, and I pushed my way to the front of that line and told my department, I'll keep the box running and answer my email, but I'm doing this. And I started giving vaccinations, and we're a large home health agency in New York City. We have about 11,000 home health aides, and so we had a bunch of people to vaccinate. And fortunately, my organization has its head on straight, and those were the first people that we vaccinated. So we went to work vaccinating home health aides, and I did that for about 4.5 months, 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, and it was personally transformative uh, experience. It's hard to imagine doing something where you're seeing about 40, 50, 60 people a day.
Mm-hmm.
Each of them have been waiting in line for hours to see you, and they're more grateful that you're doing for them than they've been grateful to any other human.
And going back to 12-hour shifts.
Yeah, well, yeah, but that was we would keep giving vaccinations until we ran out of vaccine. So that was just natural. But yeah, I was going to be the first person there, and I was going to be the last person to leave, because that was the promise that I made to myself a year earlier.
When you couldn't go.
Right.
Right.
Was
Yeah.
okay, I'm not going now. I'm hiding in my golden cage because I was in a Manhattan high rise. I literally can get anything delivered, and did. I had an outdoor terrace. I only had one other roommate, and she is a nursing home administrator. So she had to work outside the home, but she was very closely tested. She was tested every day, and
Right.
and so it was pretty much safe to live with her, even though she was going out into the world every day. So I had a very good situation for a diabetic immune. I just had problems in my feet just before COVID hit that made it very, very clear my immune system didn't work all that great. So it was very scary for me personally. So I stayed home and preserved myself. But the only way I could really live with myself doing that was I made this promise that as soon as I could do something, I would. So I also during 2020 I volunteered to be a subject in one of the phase 3 trials for the AstraZeneca
Mm-hmm.
vaccine. It was in town, and I was accepted as a subject, and I got both doses. Of course, it was a double blind, but when the mRNA vaccines became available, the study decided to reveal to everybody whether or not that they were in the treatment group, so they could make an informed choice about
Mm-hmm.
getting an mRNA vaccine. So that actually was on January 6th, 2021,
Wow.
that I got the call that I had been in the treatment group. I had gotten my second dose about 2 weeks before that. So when they called me, not only did they tell me I had gotten vaccinated, but I was at my peak immunity.
Right.
And the vaccine clinic started the very next morning
So there were some
on
people
January 7th.
who got the call and they were told you were not given the
That
vaccine.
Right. So go out and get your mRNA
Go get
vaccine
it.
right now.
Okay.
Yeah. Right.
Wow.
Right. So that was the call I was waiting on. But I also had that option. Had they told me I was in the control group, I could have showed up at work the next morning and gotten my first dose of the Moderna vaccine.
Mm.
So they were vaccinating the vaccinators first. In fact, I vaccinated most of the staff that were giving vaccines in the clinic. I vaccinated them, and because I showed up to the clinic that day fully vaccinated and at full immunity, so I was in better shape than anyone else. So I was in I was in the first room. I was in room one, and I that's where I stayed.
Well, you know
It
what?
became my room.
That kind of caps us off for the Richard story, I think, because the theme is right place, right time, right
Well, yeah, that's true.
person with the right ability to do stuff. Um, I really appreciated you coming on and talking with us so that we can hear your story. I am so glad that I got to meet you. I know that I said this before, but I have
Thank you.
never felt so lucky to just bump into somebody on a Zoom call, because that's what happened. Is I bumped into you
Yep.
on a Zoom call and said, I need to meet this person because he's so interesting. And then, of course, we have a lot of crossover in our life. We both lived in Austin at different times. And
Yep. I
I
was there
think
20 years.
you worked at St. David's. St. David's is where
I,
I have had surgeries done. I had my gallbladder taken out at St. David's. So we definitely have some wonderful crossover. I truly appreciate your time today. Thank you so, so much.
Thanks. It's just as much of a pleasure for me to meet you, and I'm glad we made the connection, and I really enjoyed talking to you.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for listening, y'all. This podcast is brought to you by Libby Heron, that's me, and a whole lot of time, fear, doubt, and a little bit of laughter. Have a good one.